Well, thank you all for being here. I apologize for having kept you waiting a few minutes. Predicting the speed of traffic in New York is not something that I'm really expert on, but I'm learning. Let me say that I speak for myself. I am no longer in the government, nor do I speak for the American Academy of Diplomacy. So what you get is my views, good or bad. And I would also say that I'm probably not going to talk a great deal about Iraq because there's an enormous amount to talk about on Afghanistan. Basically, I'm going to say two things about Iraq, and then we can come back if you want. I served in Baghdad from 2004 to 2005, 16 months, both under the end of the Bremer period and the first year of the American embassy. As you all know, things are not going well there. Stability militarily does not necessarily lead to stability politically. Let me give you a sense of what I want to talk about tonight. So Afghanistan is truly a complex place. I had a predecessor at another post who said something very appropriate about Afghanistan. She said, "You will never understand the country as clearly as on the day you arrive." After that, everything you know begins to get more complicated because it's a very detailed thing. Anybody who tells you that they can explain Afghanistan to you in a few sentences is basically wrong, and you should stop listening to them. With that said, what do I want to talk about? I want to talk very briefly about what losing means and what succeeding looks like. I want to talk at some length about the current policy because I think it is broadly misunderstood and mischaracterized in the press. The New York Times and the Washington Post regularly have stories that speak about 2014 when all foreign troops leave. There is no such intention. That's not the policy. In fact, the Washington Post had one article that used that sentence, 2014 when all foreign troops leave, and then proceeded to discuss in the article how many might stay, which I thought was illustrative of the general confusion. So I want to go through the current policy, what it is, what transition means militarily and to some extent politically, the need for a political course, to give you a sense then of what is still undefined by the administration, both in the process of transition to the 2014 date and what comes after. To give you a little sense of why the lack of clarity is adding to our own problems and why we are ourselves partially responsible for some of the problems we are experiencing in governance. To talk very briefly about negotiations, because frankly, there isn't a whole lot to talk about, and to touch very briefly on Pakistan. And I'm going to try to do that all in 30 minutes. That may suggest that even now, this will be a little superficial. And obviously there are things people will disagree with, and so I invite you to come back to them. You know, speakers always say that when they mean, I'd really like to talk more about this, but I don't have time. The audience never asks those questions. They always ask about something else. But I think it's important to understand what losing means, and very simply, I think it means an enormous invigoration of the Islamic jihadists, who are a fringe movement, but a powerful one. It means a civil war in all probability in Afghanistan. It means instability lasting in Central Asia for years, and it probably increases the chances of falling apart in Pakistan. These are very serious consequences. I could be wrong about some of them. People will say that Amanos did not fall in Vietnam. It's a wonderful line, it tells you absolutely nothing. It tells you that people can be wrong. That's about all it tells you, because in almost every other aspect, I'll turn that one off. I got this one too, so maybe we're getting doubles. But what does success mean? I think a minimum definition of success is a state and army in Afghanistan that can maintain themselves with foreign economic support and maybe a few troops, but not a massive military presence. And they may have to do it over an extended period of time. We can come back to that. Let me explain now what is the current policy that President Obama has enunciated. It is a transition by the end of 2014 to the security lead being taken by the Afghans. This is often defined as a withdrawal, and it is certainly a considerable reduction of our forces. But it is not a full turnover. So first of all, what it means is that Afghans will be doing most of the fighting on the ground. Afghan infantry will largely replace foreign infantry. But they will still have advisors with them. They will still be in combat. In fact, Secretary Panetta is not always the clearest person, did clarify that aspect on February 4 in his speech to the NATO ministers, when he was absolutely clear in saying American troops will still be in combat with Afghans after 2014. So I'm not making this up. Secondly, a great deal that has to support the troops in battle is not going to be finished by 2014. We will not be finished building air support, helicopter support. We will still be flying combat air missions. We will not be finished building the logistics. We will not be finished doing medevacs. We will not be finished, in a sense, with most of the support structure, what my military colleagues would call enablers. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that we didn't begin this process until very late. People say, you've been at this 10 years, how come doesn't that prove you can't do it? I would say it proves nothing one way or the other because of the lateness with which we got serious about this. When I left Afghanistan in 2007, we had just over 35,000 troops at that point. We were building to a target of local Afghan forces that was just over 200,000. At that same time, we had 600,000 in Iraq under arms, Iraqis. We had less than 200,000 in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a bigger country, a bigger population, and a much rougher environment. We began, that was why, by the way, I called my book The Other War, because we weren't paying any attention to it at that time. By the time it was published, of course, it was The War, but that's the problem you have picking titles a year in advance. So we will still be finishing all these things, and none of them will be really finished before about 2016. We only began to build a larger Afghan army in 2009. We only began to order much of the equipment for that army first in 2007. That means you ask the Congress for the money in 2007. You get it late in the year. It takes a while to figure out exactly what the Congress has done because it's never exactly what any administration asks for. You then write contracts to buy equipment. Equipment then gets built. And in fact, the decision to increase the size of the force delayed by a full year starting the building of most of the support services because, frankly, we simply maxed out the total capacity of all facilities to train troops. So it is on target, but it is slow because we began late. Secondly, the military picture is, I think, incredibly complex. In the South, where we have had the bulk of our offensive, we've done actually quite well. A lot of the places you were hearing about a year or two ago, Marja and other places in Helmand, you don't read about anymore, and you don't read about them because there's nothing much going on there, which means they're substantially uninteresting to people who want to write news stories about things that go bang. It is in Helmand that you have the basis for the narrative that we're making great progress. 2 points. One, until we successfully transition to Afghan control, you do not really know whether you have progress or not. It's not linear. It's not like driving back to Washington and I can tell you that I just passed Philadelphia and it's X hours to Washington, traffic permitting. Here you have the confluence of different factors. Secondly, in the East, where we have a large number of troops, security has actually gone down. Haqqani forces are more dangerous. There are more areas close to Kabul that are not secure than there used to be. I think that is manageable, but to say that there is progress is a distortion. I mean, if you just say there's progress, that is as large a distortion as to say there is no progress. You have both in different parts of the country. This kind of plays with your mind when you're trying to get to generalizations, but that is the fact. So what does this mean in terms of this transition, which has, I think, not been well explained to the American people? Because you have a sense when you hear about it with no explanation that it means one day you're gone and they're in charge. It actually doesn't mean anything of the kind. What it means is it is a process in which in some areas we will be reducing forces but putting advisors with the Afghans. We're increasing the density of our advisors. We have a lot of advisors. In other areas, for a time, you will see U.S. forces leading in areas where there's some heavy combat necessary and where reducing what is now an entrenched Taliban and Haqqani presence requires efforts that we probably have not yet built the Afghan army to handle. So you're going to see both. And you're going to need, or our military are going to need, a flexible enough force that they can reinforce when things go bad, that they can still lead where they have to, even as they gradually step down. Because I have to tell you that building a force of quality is a longer process than building a force of numbers. You can get numbers quickly. You cannot get quality quickly. And if you want to reduce the budget so that you have to have smaller and better, that takes even longer than having large and better. And I'll come back to that issue in a second. So you will see a gradual process, but the understanding of what it means and the understanding of why you need flexible forces is the basis for the contention that the military really wants to keep most of the force that will be present after the withdrawals already scheduled for 2012. Just to walk you through the numbers, 10,000 came out last year, 23,000 more troops, that is the rest of the surge, will come out at the end of summer of this year. That leaves 68,000. And you will see the military, I think, arguing within the chain of command to retain most of those for at least another year. And I'm giving you only my opinion, but I would submit that to speed up that withdrawal in 2013 is to take enormous risks. If you take green troops and you give them too much responsibility too fast, you are asking for collapse. It is necessary to push the Afghans to take more responsibility and to take it more quickly. But that process has to be modulated by the realities on the ground. And you will add to the risk of failure and the risk that you waste the lives of our people if you try to pull it down too much faster. Now, what is undecided? And maybe I should just add, you are also looking at a period when our aid is going to be cut by about half. That is a function of the budget deficit in this country. It will still be the largest aid program in the world, but it will be a lot less than it is now. You are also looking at a second shock to the Afghan economy, because as our troops go down, all the things they spend money on in Afghanistan are lessened. So you have the economic shock that comes from the troop withdrawal and a decline in aid at the same time. This is going to be a little difficult on the Afghan economy. It has a number of prospects for the long term. People tend to say, well, is this permanently unsustainable? The answer is, we don't know. There is a potential for gas. There's a potential for oil. There are rare minerals. There are copper deposits. The Chinese are investing $3 billion to develop those. But the extent of these is still really not very clear. I don't want to hype this. And secondly, there's a question you're only going to see over time, and that is, does the government handle this well so that money produced by all these things spreads out in the country and increases the economy, or do you have a process that enriches a few people leaving the country poor and does very little? And there'll be a lot of work spent on that. Excuse me. There is a need for a more attentive political course. There are limits to how much we can control politics, especially with another country. We have a little problem controlling politics in our own country. But there are issues we need to be focusing on, particularly maintaining pressure for a better election in 2014. There are things we can be doing about that, which we're not doing adequately. Some of this may get clarified. There is a NATO summit, presidents, prime ministers, in May in Chicago, where I think you will see a rolling out of some more clarity. At least I hope so. Where there is a considerable lack of clarity, however, is our intentions after 2014. We are talking about a certain amount of military presence, but that's not defined at all in numbers. And this is causing a great deal of confusion in the Afghans, the Pakistanis, the regional states. When I was back in Afghanistan 2010, I was back in March of last year, I was back in November of last year. The one point on which I found agreement between President Karzai and his strongest critics was that they had no idea what our policy was after 2014. They continually asked me, what do you want? What's your intention? You have to understand that Afghanistan is a traumatized country from years of warfare and years of foreign interventions. And our role is huge. And Afghans, Pakistanis, enemies, friends position themselves in part on their understanding of what they think we're going to do. When they don't know what we're going to do, they make assumptions and proceed on the basis of that assumption. For Afghans who are betting their lives on the policy and who have watched foreigners leave, the assumption of a great many is we're going to pull out too early, we're going to pull out our forces too fast, and what we've built will crumble. That's a very dangerous assumption because that assumption triggers very counterproductive behavior. We complain about governance. We got a lot of reason to complain about governance because there's a huge amount of corruption, some of which we fuel the way we do our aid, but a lot of which is their fault. But when you have this lack of clarity about what will happen in 2014, you have to put yourself for a moment in the place of Afghans. What is the logical what are the logical actions you take if you make the assumption the Americans, and with them the rest of the coalition, are going to bail out? Well, one is I better steal more faster because I have to run. That lack of clarity itself is a major driver of corruption. It's not the only reason, but it is a driver. Second, if you plan to remain in Afghanistan and fight as an Afghan leader, then you look around to solidify your ties with the people who will fight with you. Ethnic groups, militias, tribes. At that point, you are building an alliance that is not about the development of the army, but the development of older forces, and you don't care very much. You don't have the luxury to care whether the people you're building alliances with are corrupt and rapacious, because they're the price of your physical survival. So when we go in and talk about corruption without being able to talk about what we're going to do, to an Afghan ear, it sounds like, I know you can't survive if you fire these people and we don't stay, but I can't tell you if we're going to stay, but you really ought to fire them. And then we wonder, why is this discourse not completely persuasive? It also affects the Pakistani view. Their view has been for some time, and they give us a lot of trouble because of the sanctuaries, that we're going to bail out early and Afghanistan's going to collapse. Pakistani worldview, I'm really simplifying here, but it is that their predominant threat comes from India. The Indians are going to make common cause with the Northern Alliance, and they will be encircled and threatened, and therefore they darn well better maintain ties with people who will fight on their side, some of whom happen to be fighting us. That gives you a weird Pakistani policy in which they fight extremism at home and yet cooperate and don't really crack down on the sanctuaries. And it is complicated by the fact that their own military is probably overstretched. It's not very clear if they actually have the ability to suppress the sanctuaries as well. So you have reasons to believe that you can, I believe that it is possible to build the Army as we intend. It's not assured, and our reductions already are making the margin thinner. But I think it is still possible. I know one of the questions General Allen asked his senior staff when he took over after the president made his decisions on withdrawal, which came just about the time General Allen went to Afghanistan. He asked his staff to tell him, is this possible? And this is their internal discussions. And they looked pretty hard at it. Their answer was, yes, it is possible, just. It's not a lot, it's one thing to do just-in-time supply for your business. It's not a great way to fight a war. Wars are characterized by enormous uncertainty. Things go wrong. The enemy had the learning curve. I've had 4 wars that I've been experienced in. I fought as a soldier, as an officer in Vietnam, Algeria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So I know something about this subject. And trust me, it's really hard to predict. So you have these uncertainties which need definition, and you have other parts of the policy. What does transition mean? What are we planning on doing in 2014, at least militarily, which are partially defined in the policy, but which are not well explained, I think, even to the American people. And so to go back to that little story I mentioned about the way they write this sentence in the New York Times and the Washington Post, if our major journals get the policy wrong repeatedly in their writings, one can be somewhat understanding of why Afghans and Pakistanis and Iranians and others get it wrong too. And as I said, it has a major influence because we are so big. Everybody takes position on us to some extent. Sometimes people say to me, what's the Afghan vision for their future? But without knowing what the biggest power and the largest military on the ground are going to do, Afghans can't answer that question. It's like saying to your architect, I need you to design the plans to build my house, but I can't tell you now if it's going to be on flat sand or a steep rocky slope. No architect can produce a plan with that degree of uncertainty. So, in this, we also have this business of negotiation. Now, I believe it is worth trying to negotiate. It's worth talking. It's always worth talking because it's the only way you know whether there is an opportunity that can be developed. But there are a couple of things you really need to understand. First of all, negotiations and fighting are not alternatives. They are parallel courses which you continue simultaneously. The late Israeli Prime Minister Rabin understood this. He was asked, how can you negotiate when you're under threat, when you're dealing with terrorism? Rabin answered that I must fight terrorism as though there are no negotiations, and I must negotiate as though there is no terrorism. He understood the issue. When you look at the history of conflicts that have been resolved through negotiation, whether in Nicaragua, East Timor, some bits of El Salvador, Cambodia, Namibia, Angola, what you see, Mozambique's another one, what you see is a very long process, a long time in which you talk about talking before you actually get down to negotiations usually, and then often a long negotiation period. And you get success, if you do, when all parties decide they can't achieve their maximum aims through force, but they can get something sufficiently satisfactory to be worth closing a deal. We're not there yet, and the lack of clarity about what we will do post-2014, or even a certain lack of clarity about what we'll do in 2013, makes it more difficult to get to the psychological point where all parties believe they've got a solution. So I know a certain amount about what's going on, but for purposes of the moment, let me just say again, these are not alternatives, and there is no possibility of it being, no possibility, nobody ever knows, very little possibility that you will have a quick resolution through negotiations. In fact, the more you talk about, we need negotiations, that's the way, let's go, the more you suggest desperation. And the result of that is either the price goes up or you have to spend more time convincing people that you're not desperate. And sometimes I've said that if you act too desperate in negotiations, it's a little like going into the rug bazaar and saying, that's the finest carpet I've ever seen. I absolutely have to have it. What's your best price? If you take that approach, you shouldn't be allowed to buy rugs, let alone do negotiations. And there is a bit too much of that in the press. There's a somewhat breathless anticipation of things going faster. And then when you get breathless anticipation, then what you usually get as a result is disillusionment and discouragement as a follow-on, because you were raising expectations to levels you could not deal with. And with Pakistan, what you have is a country where we share some interests. We share an interest in the stability of the state of Pakistan. We share an interest in their combating religious extremism within Pakistan. We do not share a view of the support which they are simultaneously giving to people fighting us, even as they have given us support. What this translates to, for me, in terms of policy, is this is not a basis for a strategic friendship. Strategic friendship means you share an enormous number of common strategic purposes. This is more the basis for a kind of transactional relationship in which you are going to be supporting on some things and you're going to be pushing hard. And, if you don't like drones, try B-52s. You're going to be taking violent action at times that offend them. But again, it's another place where you have to manage a difficult policy on two lines simultaneously. What we have done is to keep being pulled back and forth between efforts at strategic friendship with the assumption that then they'll do it our way on the issues where they see things differently, or anger and sanctions. I think you need more pressure on Pakistan in terms of what we do militarily at times. I would be opposed to things like sanctions because we don't want to weaken the state as a whole. To say that this is a supremely difficult policy, first to carry out and second to explain in a large and raucous democracy like ours, is probably an understatement. But it is the kind of policy we will need. I just want to note one thing. We've had a whole series of actions which have caused great anger in the Pakistanis, some of which caused some anger among us. We had this business of a contractor, Raymond Davis, who shot a Pakistani on the street. That caused a certain amount of ire, as of course it would if we found a foreign contractor working for a foreign government shooting somebody on the streets of Washington, even if maybe his actions were in some ways justified. And then we had the wonderfully successful raid that killed Osama bin Laden. That was the right decision, the right thing to do, but it shamed the Pakistani military. Now, I think they've got a lot to account for. How did this guy live in Abbottabad? It's like living outside West Point. And you don't know about it. So there's a reason to press them hard on this. But at the same time, one should understand that in a culture where shame and honor are very large components of culture, you've shamed the largest, most powerful institution in Pakistan. So part of what you got out of that was, rather than reacting to what they ought to react to, what were you guys doing letting him live there, you got people going into an internal kind of navel-gazing process. And then we had this bombing, which was accidental. It killed 24 soldiers. And the Pakistanis don't believe it was accidental. A whole lot of things one could say about it. And that's when they closed the border. Now, there's one interesting thing to note. The border's been closed now for almost 3 months. And that has cost us a lot of money because we're bringing supplies through Russia and Tajikistan, these areas. There is one piece that is very little written about, however, which the Pakistanis have not closed off, and that is overflights. And it's important to understand that we are not allowed to bring any munitions through the northern supply route. We can bring oil and food and petrol and all these things. We cannot bring munitions yet. We don't have permission for that. All of the munitions we expend in combat in Afghanistan overfly Pakistan. That they have not closed down. If they did, we would have the choice between losing in Afghanistan and having some kind of an armed confrontation with Pakistan. And they've steered away from that. So while they've made our life more difficult and more expensive, they have not closed off the most critical element which they could control. And you can analyze that in various ways, but it's worth knowing, and I have not seen it particularly written in the press. So to come back, leaving hopefully lots of time for questions, a little time, I think we pay an enormous price if we lose. I think a measure of success is possible, but it is extremely difficult. We have a reasonable transition policy which we are not clearly explaining. We have a great deal of lack of clarity and undefined policy for the period 2014. That lack of clarity is impacting the political process and the professionalization of the army in Pakistan and causing problems. It's creating a kind of isometric exercise in our policy. You know, an isometric exercise is one where you push against yourself, you get very tired, and you don't go anywhere. And the lack of clarity creates that kind of isometric tension in what we're trying to achieve. We've begun negotiations which have a huge number of problems. I would say a very small chance of success, but a chance. They are worth pursuing because you don't, as long as you don't get too avid about it and mortgage the rest, you don't lose anything for talking, so you might as well try. But it's not a silver bullet that's going to get us out quickly. And we have a very difficult relationship with Pakistan. So I think what we face is, frankly, a rather long struggle. We can bring the budget down a great deal, but we should be careful that we don't bring it down so much that it's pointless to be there. It is still going to be expensive, but losing is really expensive too. And that's my basic message. So I'm open to your questions. Do you want to pick them or you want me to pick them?